Responding to human crises in a fractured world. In today's overlapping crises, pandemic, conflict, displacement, climate shocks, health and humanitarian system, and health system and state system are being stretched past their limits, often at the same time. Pandemic, as we said many times, do not operate in isolation and instead create additional crises by enhancing systems, communities, and individual vulnerabilities. In the next panel, our panelists will focus on the multiplying nature of crises within crises, specifically on the mobility aspect of crises. People on the move, people who don't move, people who want to travel. So we will explore that, how to respond to this quickly, ethically, and effectively about mobility. And so before we get started, and while our guests, Conrad Sauvé, Kelley Lee, and Paul Wise join me on the stage, we're going to put the Mentimeter. And the question to you is, do you think the pandemic was used as an excuse for border control? That's a good question, guys. Come on, play. Wait. Thank you very much for your vote. So I will introduce our guests on the panel. Again, I won't pay tribute to all of what they are doing, but I have here Paul Wise, Professor Paul Wise from Stanford University. He's by training a pediatrician and someone in public health, but by practice a humanitarian. His work bridges child health, policy, international relations, and security studies. From July 2019 to September 2025, Dr. Wise served as the juvenile care monitor for the U.S. federal court overseeing the treatment of migrant children in U.S. detention. In December 2025, Dr. Wise was appointed as the mediator between ICE and lawyers representing children in ICE custody. Our other panelist is Kelley Lee. Kelley Lee is globally recognized leader in global health governance and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair at Simon Fraser University. She is spearheading the Pandemic and Border Project. She is known for being a powerful and bright voice in the global health policy and an amazing hockey player. You get to know that. There's an amazing movie on her called Over Time. Conrad Sauvé is the president and CEO of the Canadian Red Cross, where he has strengthened emergency management and health programming while leading major domestic and international responses. Under his leadership, the Red Cross has assisted over 1 million disaster-impacted Canadians and deployed the only Red Cross field hospital in North America to more than 50 global health emergencies. We're very glad to have them to join us today. And so what we're going to do in this panel is we're going to talk about mobility, so people who are in forced displacement, people who want to travel, or people who cannot move. And then we start for the first intervention. Each panelist will do a 5 to 6 minute intervention, and after that we're going to have follow-up question. So we're going to start with Paul.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here and to celebrate the launch of PERL. Thank you, Joanne, for all you've done. I'm going to begin to answer the question that you posed to the general audience, and I'm sorry to break your hearts. But in March 2020, the United States, under the first Trump administration, imposed what's called Title 42 of the U.S. Federal Code, which is a public health statute where the CDC can declare a public health emergency, and functionally the borders can be sealed to the extent that the operational police want to close the border. Basically, it meant that the U.S.-Mexican border was supposed to be shut, and that all people coming across the border, regardless of their asylum claims, would be returned to Mexico. Title 42 was imposed in March of 2020. It was rescinded, taken off in May 2023. 2.5 million single adults, 350,000 individuals in families, and 16,000 unaccompanied children were turned back to Mexico under Title 42 during that period. Initially, it was imposed at a moment of great fear about COVID, but very quickly it was recognized that it had nothing to do with containing the pandemic, it had nothing to do with infectious disease. After a few months, when everybody recognized that it was doing nothing about COVID, it was clearly operating as a political device, as an instrument of immigration control. So the answer, at least in the United States case, and Title 42, is that this was intensely political. It was political based on fear in the United States. There's another part of this story, however, that will explain what ICE is doing currently in the United States and how it fits into a broad strategy. I was appointed by the federal court in July of 2019. 3 days later, I was in McAllen, Texas, at the famous Kids in Cages facility in McAllen, and I was the first non-government person with authority and access to go into any of the detention facilities. This was run by Border Patrol. And they had a whole group, a whole entourage of Border Patrol leadership, lawyers, and they took me around. They were very professional. And then I said, I want to go in and talk to some of the kids on my own. They said, fine, we'll wait out here, you go ahead and talk. And I went in, a bunch of kids came up to me, and what Joanne did not mention is that since I was a sophomore in college, I have been working in Highland, Guatemala, in communities there, lived there for a while, and a little 12-year-old, I could immediately see he was Guatemalan, comes up and he says, hey doc, in Spanish, and I told him why I was there, asked a bit where he was from, and then I began to apologize. This is no way that we should be taking care of you. They had little mats on the ground with Mylar blanket. It was cold. Food wasn't great. They hadn't seen any medical. And there were lots of kids in this little containment area. And I was apologizing to him, and he looked puzzled. And I stopped, and he said, Doc, this is my best day. Este es mi mejor día, in Spanish. And then I was the one who looked puzzled. He said, Doc, I left my village in Guatemala 2 months ago. I traveled with a group of strange men I had never met. We got beat up, we were robbed. I was afraid I was going to be killed. It took 2 months riding on the top of a train to get here. And I got here last night. Border Patrol, I was looking for Border Patrol. Border Patrol brought me here. Last night was the first night that I've slept in 2 months. And now I'm in the United States. I made it. He schooled me my first day. I thought I was a big expert because I had read all about it. Pediatrician, a mentee of Joanne Liu, and he schooled me in 5 minutes of conversation. It was about hope. And it brought a kind of humility to my understanding of the situation. But it also resonated with a veteran Border Patrol agent who I got to know. He said, hope is the currency on the border. You can build walls, people will go over them, under them, and around them. The only way to stop migration to the border is to eliminate any hope. You will be released into the United States and thrive in the United States. If you eradicate hope, It sounds like this sentimental pediatrician, touchy-feely thing. No, it is the currency, it is the instrument of border control on the U.S. southern border. In December of 2023, under Biden, there were 120,000 individuals and families in that month that crossed the border into the United States. In December, this past December 2025, just a couple months ago, there were 538. Not 538,000, 538 in detention that month on the border. The border is quiet, the border is shut. Why? Because the Trump administration has eliminated all hope that they will be released into the United States. What's going on with ICE currently is, okay, we've got the border shut. We want to eliminate any hope that you will be able to stay in the United States if you had made it into the United States. The idea is to eliminate any hope that you will be able to live and thrive, your kids will be able to live and thrive in the United States. Fear and hope. And building, supplementing a bit on what Michael said, is when you have fear and hope as the currency engaged, it is always political. Quarantine is a political act. There are many colleagues, I'm a pediatrician in medical school, public health, who had the sense, follow the science. The politics is nuisance, it's noise. I would suggest it's other way around. The pandemic is intensely political, and that you must marry the science with a sophisticated understanding of the political. You cannot get people to act through mandate alone. It has to be felt. It's about identity. When people talk about trust, think political, particularly now. So my suggestion, to answer the question, the border was used, the pandemic was used to close the border politically, but the pandemic can only be addressed through a sophisticated understanding of the politics as it develops. Thank you.
Okay. That's a lot of food for thought. Good. Thank you very much, Paul. We're going to come back with follow-up questions, but then I'll give the floor to Conrad because you dealt with people on the move as well to a certain extent, and then you tell us what the Red Cross has done.
Yes, thank you, Joanne. And for me, can you hear me? Is it on? Yeah. Also a pleasure to be here. I'm trying to go from what Paul said to what I don't think it's. Yeah.
Here, this one's working.
All right. Thank you. That better? It doesn't sound like it's working, but oh, it is. All right, now it sounds like. Okay, well, thank you, Joanne. Thank you for being here. And I'm trying to bridge a little bit from what Paul's saying to, because I'll tell you a bit more of the practical experience of the Red Cross and our work during the pandemic, and a little bit to the question of how we weren't prepared. Maybe quickly, 3 ingredients. During the pandemic, it was one of our largest responses in recent history in terms of the Canadian Red Cross. And I don't want to say unprecedented because every year we have some kind of unprecedented event. And we've had the massive fires last year. We had the asylum seekers. But there's a few ingredients in terms of the Canadian Red Cross's work. And as Joanne talked about it, we are engaged in the last 20 years in deploying mobile field capacity for all kinds of responses, including cholera and Ebola responses. And we're deployed domestically for mostly natural disasters and people being displaced. Those 2 ingredients came together at the beginning of the pandemic when we were called to support the first Canadians arriving at Trenton. Trenton's a military air base in Ontario, and it was the first arrivals from Wuhan and from the cruise ships. And we were asked just to provide support, shelter, food, and we're deploying a team. And it got complicated when we asked the Public Health Agency, what protocols do we use? And there were no protocols. They said to us, go talk to Ontario, because it's an Ontario landing, so Ontario, there are no protocols. So we deployed we re-affected our international team right away, and we wrote the protocols. So the teams that did the cholera and the Ebola responses, we wrote the protocols. And it's interesting just to tell you that we also connected, and I'm going to talk a lot about the value of the work we're doing internationally and how it helps us be able to respond. But at the same time, before the plane landed, there were previous planes landing in Germany, and we were in contact with the German Red Cross and the protocols they were putting in place from the same flights coming in from Wuhan. So this began a little bit of our work where we didn't know where we'd play a role. Soon after this, I got a call from with Joanne. We did a course here at McGill, a master's, and I got a call from Dr. Nadine Larente, who was heading the western part of the operations here for seniors. She had the day before, I think, gone into one of the long-term care facilities with her 2 children to provide basic care because there were no longer employees, or not enough employees, to provide basic care to seniors in that place. And so she called me that morning and said, I'm going straight to the Red Cross. I'm not going to the structures. Can you help me? So we put a team together, and the bottom line is we created a team of infectious disease people with experience, and they said, okay, we've got 10 long-term care centers. There's a worse cases. Can you help us with those? So we deployed teams of 3. And what we found, first of all, of course, the high number of people that were infected, a high number of employees that were infected, but to go back to what we're talking about, a high number of employees that weren't showing up because they were afraid. And the teams we deployed, they came into the centers with backpacks, with red tape, green tape, yellow tape, and they helped them practically rebuild the trust in terms of how they can control the spread of the infectious. So what we saw, they asked us to do 10. Within 5 days, the infection rates diminished. Things were stabilized. They asked us to do 30. They asked us to do 300. 300. We did, at the end, 450 long-term care centers. And so we deployed these teams throughout the country. It's interesting, we were in Laval. The penitentiary there, federal penitentiary, found out. So we did all the federal penitentiaries, and we did all the quarantines. I think the important message is, again, it's not incompatible, or it's very compatible to be engaged constantly internationally on an operational basis, and to understand and to keep updating your protocols. And when we were going into the long-term care centers, of course, they were receiving all kinds of directives on what to do, but it wasn't helping them in that practical situation. And it was building that trust at that moment. And we engaged there the same way we engage internationally, is when we go into another context, we're there as guests. We're not going to be there forever, so we're helping strengthen the existing system. So I just wanted to, there's a whole bunch of other aspects that we did at that time, but I wanted to strengthen those 2 aspects and relationships. Now the challenges are, we ready? Our funding for our international operations are diminishing. Everything is in silos in terms of the response. Public health is in one, public safety is another space, our First Nation response another space, and our international is another space. None of them are connected in a strategy. So I just wanted to share a bit of that in terms of the response.
Thank you very much. And then to look at another aspect of mobility, Kelley has been working on what we call the Border Project, and we're going to show one slide. But she's going to speak about the travel and the different, I would say, rules around travel.
Thank you, Joanne, and congratulations to you and Prativa and the team for the launch of PERL. It's really exciting to be here and feel the energy in the room, and I really appreciate the invitation to share our work, which is focused around the use of travel measures during COVID-19. So if you cast your minds back to 2019, it was a world where we were very hypermobile. So they were setting, year upon year records in terms of travel, in terms of tourism, business travel, other types of travel. And of course, we also had a lot of displaced populations, so it wasn't not always fun and games. There was people traveling and being forced to travel. And so at the same time, COVID landed in a world which was highly unequal. So we had unequal wealth and income, but also inequalities in terms of who could travel and who could not travel and under what conditions. So all of this was there before COVID happened. And then what happened when the pandemic hit was that WHO recommended not to use travel restrictions. This was January 20th or so. And the idea was that in the past, we've never really found a good rationale for restricting travel when there's a major outbreak. We had that with HIV/AIDS, with Ebola, and usually it's criticized very heavily as discriminatory, unnecessary. It also dissuades other countries from reporting, outbreaks, and so it's punitive. And so WHO recommended against it. So I just wanted to show this one slide that I was allowed to show. Joanne was very strict. She allowed me one slide. But this is based on research. So making sense. Our project, we don't do like on the ground work like Conrad and Paul, which I really salute your important work. We're in our offices trying to figure out what are all these countries doing all of a sudden. WHO said don't use travel restrictions, and then you have this happen. So every time they make a declaration, so it was the fake declaration, public health emergency of international concern, up spikes the travel measures. And then when the pandemic was formally declared, they used the term pandemic in March, again, up spiked the use of travel measures, mainly restrictions. And so clearly was the opposite of what WHO was recommending. And we're really in unprecedented territory here. We've never had 194 countries do this and do it in a way that is so prolonged, often changing, and way beyond restrictions. So we had quarantine, testing, screening, and also eventually immunity certification or use of vaccines. So there's a lot of different measures being used in different ways. So our group was trying to make sense of that and to try and understand, first of all, were countries actually doing something wrong? Was it against the IHR? And I know Regine Habibi is here. She was going to talk about the IHR. But I would say that at the time we realized actually it's not illegal. It wasn't against international law. And there seemed to be a paradigm shift that from not using these travel restrictions ever, or at least in a very minimal way, last resort, to actually maybe there's evidence to show that rapid use of restrictions could actually buy you time. Could buy you time to take care of your health system, get things up in place, but it's not a good way of, in the long term, of managing a major outbreak like this. And yet a lot of countries did. So then we tried to think about, well, is this sensible? Why are they doing it? What is the evidence that it's effective? And we looked a lot of things. It was a very complicated picture. Countries were doing each of these combination of measures differently. 194 different ways of doing this. So comparative analysis was virtually impossible across countries. But we did find that there was evidence, of course, that COVID was spread by travel. We know that. It didn't walk across borders on its own. We know that. We know new variants spread repeatedly from travel, was introduced into new jurisdictions. So we knew that was happening, but could we do anything about it? Was it worth putting those measures into place? And, there's always a mixed picture on this. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. In public health terms, you could try and reduce the introduction of a virus into your country if you have very few cases yourself. Again, very, very temporary, but it can be done, and we had countries do that. So they had a kind of suppression and even elimination strategy. Other countries like Canada, I think geographically impossible, because we have a long border with the US, we have air, land, and sea arrivals. We just have a very difficult way of, a difficult job of trying to keep people, managing the mobility of people. And over a 3-year period, it proved impossible. But I think just tying back to the first two speakers, what we really also learned was that there are secondary impacts from these measures. There's human costs, and over the last 6 years, I did this research starting in early 2020. The number of heartbreaking stories you hear, people who could not travel for genuine human reasons, right? To attend a funeral, to care for loved ones, to family reunification. And now we're hearing, separation of families, persecution of migrants, people stuck at sea for months on ships working, and they could not get home. They were stuck out there, and that was pretty difficult. People stuck at borders who were, traveling as refugees. They were sort of frozen in where they were. So there's many cases, but there are, it was not very much appreciated at first that these measures were having those impacts. And so I guess where we are now is that, was it worth it? I think from a public health perspective, there is an argument for initially using some form of these measures depending on the pathogen. We still have to figure that out. But we also have to appreciate the secondary unintended consequences of, if you're going to put these measures in place, we have to think about equity, and we didn't do that. And there was some remediation, but eventually, we saw the results of the inequities. People were really pushing back and really criticizing how these measures were used. And I would say that, again, this is really unprecedented. We're in a very globalized world. We value mobility. At the same time, we're worried, I guess, about, pandemic events. And so you put policymakers in an impossible situation where public health officials had to do things that they never were trained to do. Managing borders was not something on a massive scale for 3-4 years, was not in the curriculum. So making those decisions on a daily basis or a weekly basis, it was really impossible. So our work really is trying to support better decision making, or at least try and have a framework for saying, okay, if this happens again, along comes a pathogen, we have to assess airborne, human-to-human transmission, sustained, certain severity, and so on. There's certain criteria. Then we look at our jurisdiction. Do we have a good healthcare system? Is it robust enough? Do we have a good border management system? Do we have, are we reliant on trade, et cetera? We have to assess those. But then we have to do risk assessment, not only of the public health measures, the public health criteria, but social, political, economic risks of these measures. And so taking those all into account, and this has to be done really quickly when you have an unfolding pandemic, but this is, what needs to really think about when you're considering those sorts of measures. And hopefully, this will be the best way forward. Countries will always do different things. I think that we can't get away from that. But we can have some consensus on what we need to consider when we're adopting these measures. So that's where we're at. And I don't think we're in a better place. I think we still are going to have chaos again if we don't figure this out. And that's my real worry, is that the next time another SARS-CoV-2 type thing comes along, I think countries will reach quickly for restricting travel. And that actually is very concerning.
Wow. Okay. Where we're going to take ourselves from here. So I think what I hear is the idea of this panel was really that I wanted to talk about human crisis in times of pandemic with different angles. So angles of people on the move, in forced displacement, with migration, regular people who travel, and then people who are attending to different communities, like the people in long-term care facilities who new arriving people that you put in quarantine. So, Paul, can you, because I think it's so fascinating, your work at the border, and you have told me in the past that the flow, yes, there were the border control measure, but there were as well the cartel. Can you tell us more about that and what are their role in that dynamic?
Right. Well, the U.S. Mexican border is controlled by the cartels, the Mexican cartels. As much as Border Patrol would like to think that they control it, it's generally the cartels, the smugglers. And the utility of recognizing the flow, the causes, the mechanisms of the flow was critically important. Even at the height of Title 42 removals, they basically just put them on buses at the border and turned them right around, sent it to Mexico. About half of the people hitting the border were actually being released into the United States. Why? Because Mexico wouldn't take them. The Mexican authorities metered how many Title 42 returned individuals would be accepted. And they said, we're not taking any kid less than 6. So any family that had a 6-year-old or below, they got released into the United States. And then it turned out we're not taking any unaccompanied children. And when the Biden administration came in, they kept Title 42 for another year and a half. But they said no unaccompanied child is going to be returned. But there were still many who were coming across. And the cartels, the smuggling routes, were basically responding to the return flows. And they're pretty smart. They gave the migrants a threefer during Title 42. So you get pushed back into Mexico, try again. And it won't cost you anything extra. And you get 3 shots. And if you don't make it then, that's your problem. People spend their life savings taking out horrendous loans, mostly from Central America, places that I've been working for so long, to get to the border. They have 3 shots. And that ended when Trump came in a second time. And they said, no releases, end of story, we don't care. And they reopened a family detention facility in Dilley, Texas, which now has about 1,000 individuals. And I can say this now because it came out in the Washington Post last night, is that there are 2 measles cases in Dilley right now. And the concern is that this is going to spread. It's going to be a very difficult place for ICE to control the spread there. But we'll see. But it's always a dance between law enforcement policies, immigration policies, public health policies, and the cartels.
Okay, we got to digest that. Okay, let's switch gear. Conrad, the Red Cross has been doing amazing thing, and then we'd like to hear more about this surge capacity in times of crisis and how they have managed.
Yeah, well, and I really enjoyed Michael's presentation again, that we're not going to avoid this. And my concern again is we wanted to do an after-action review, and there has been no after-action review. And so we've talked about the fragility. We walked into the long-term care centers. They weren't equipped to deal with this level of contagion. And then the trust level went down. I think the other layer for us was also there's 200,000 nonprofits in the country that do extremely important work. And so we set up a whole program supported by the federal government to provide PPE, training, et cetera. And of course, the protocols were changing all the time, so you have to have a direct link to help that. I think in all these systems, there is a lot of capacity in the community. Joanne was asking me as well, we hired 5,000 people during that time, and people said, well, how did you do that in the time of COVID with all these restrictions? We set up a temporary hiring agency here in Montreal, and we took the staff from Bombardier, Air Canada, Cirque du Soleil, that were all literally grounded, right? And so, there is capabilities. But my point again is the long-term care were extremely fragile. The community side was extremely fragile. And, the people rely on these food banks, these supports in the community. And we weren't addressing those at the beginning in terms of their needs of feeling safe to be able to, not just for themselves, but also the people they're working with.
Thank you. So Kelley, you showed us that graph, and then tell us, because you were very generic, but can you tell us a few countries who did well and others who didn't do that well? Which is Chatham House, eh?
Okay, yeah, sounds like an easy question to answer. I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve with these travel measures. I would say the U.S. did particularly poorly. That's probably not a big surprise. They didn't, meet the public health goals, which is to limit virus introduction and onward transmission through travel measures. But they're also highly discriminatory, as Paul described, and there's many other examples of that. Canada did relatively better than the US, only because there was more consistency and less, overt discrimination. But there were some definitely inequities in terms of who was allowed to travel and who wasn't. And I think that point about, pandemic responses being political is absolutely true. Values are underpinning these decisions, and who you value, who is considered an essential traveler versus a non-essential traveler is often a political decision. But pulling back, I guess, some countries did relatively better at the public health goals. So you could think, often of Australia saying, well, they imposed a very strict restriction on who could come into the country, and then they were quarantined for a prolonged period. Everybody who came into the country was required to do that. But then you would say, from a social or economic point of view, a lot of Australians were stuck outside the country. They couldn't actually afford to buy the air tickets because it was all business class tickets to get in. So they were stuck and had to, live outside the country for a long time. So the fairness issue was a problem there. Often you think of Singapore, Taiwan, possibly countries that used travel measures relatively well and provided access to facilities and so on. But I guess if I was going to give a star to a country, it might be New Zealand, because actually they had a fairer system where, yes, you couldn't go into the country unless you had a slot to go in, but it was by a sort of a lottery system, and it seemed more fair because it wasn't just by could you afford a business class ticket. So people felt that sense of fairness, which is important when we talk about trust. When people feel they have a equal shot at something, I think they perhaps see that people are trying to be fair, and so I think that I would say that in terms of poor, I would say countries that would put measures on and then take them off because they were reacting, like the new variants. I think Canada was guilty of that. We heard the South African variant, the Omicron, and then suddenly, we're going to exclude all these countries. Well, it's a bit late at that point. The virus was probably already in Canada. Reacting that way because, people had, I guess, pressuring politicians to act or look like they're doing something. That's generally not a good way of making policy. So yes, I would say on balance, we have more poor performance than good performance, unfortunately, because again, it was unprecedented. I think people were just trying things. It was a very difficult, fast-moving situation. So I think the thing is we need to do better next time. Learn the lessons from the poor performances.
I think we all agree on that. Do you want to jump back about Canada and how we fare, Conrad? Because you heard, through the Federation of the Red Cross, you went and heard the different response. We had that discussion in the past.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't have a scientific analysis, but we open up the channel directly with the Chinese, the Koreans, the Italians, and we tried to do that. I mean, our general sense is, for example, the South Koreans were very fast in putting in measures in the community to be able to house people that were infected and so on. So we felt a lot. But, I think one of the key things, and we mentioned it before, what we felt is they had maintained some expertise from SARS to COVID. In Canada, we didn't feel that. The same people were, I remember talking to some people in Ontario saying, well, everybody's gone from SARS, and they're looking through the boxes of what they did, right? We're not maintaining an expertise and the learnings from what we did well or not well. And we didn't do, again, the after-action review of what we did during this response, and how are we going to keep it? And I know I'm dealing right now at the government level, at the federal level, the key players we worked with just retired. The whole generation retired, so I'm thinking we're going to have to re-explain.
It's a sign for us. Right, thank you. So I would like to keep some time for questions, but before we close this, I'd like to have a last round, and the question is, key lesson learned you want us to remember from your perspective. So Paul, about migrant children protection and their protection in times of public health measure. For Conrad, for vulnerable communities in times of health crisis, and for Kelley about travel ban use. Lesson learned that you want us to remember. To just say, if I had one plea, one thing to ask, please guys remember that.
Well, I sound a bit like a broken record, but think political. The cartels in Mexico were handing out boxes of hand sanitizer and face masks to people in their communities with El Chapo's face on the box. That's the cartel leader. Okay. Pandemic is a shock. It has technical requirements. You should read Michael's book because it's an amazing analysis and highly predictive. But my suggestion is it's always a part of the struggle for legitimacy. When you hear the word trust, that's political commentary, and that we recognize that our embrace of the best technical approach, epidemiology, infectious disease approach to pandemic preparedness, needs to be associated, combined, integrated into a sophisticated political analysis of what happened, what's happening now, and what's likely to come in the future.
So it was hard to follow Paul there on those aspects, but I think the commonality there is we're talking in terms of our planning of disruptive events. We've just faced the largest fire season in central Canada. We're going to see the combination of fire, natural disasters in a pandemic, and we're addressing these things always in a fragmented way. There's an expertise in terms of the public health side, but there's a commonality in terms of how you prepare the community. We're putting a lot of money in military. We're not putting a lot in community resilience and community preparedness, right? Maybe one submarine in that space would help us quite a bit.
Kelley?
And I would finish by saying that I think we all continue to value our ability to travel. I think in this room it's a very mobile population, many of you traveling around the world. But beyond this, I think the world is a better place because we can travel. So we need to figure out how to do that, even during a pandemic. And I think the issue has become so controversial and negative in the public mind. Travel measures during a pandemic, they think it's a negative thing. We need to reframe it as enabling people to travel safely and securely even during a pandemic. So we have to figure this out rather than trying to shut the world down.
We have in the room few people that have been at the front line of COVID-19 here in Canada, and we have the privilege to have them. I have asked them priorly if they would be happy. Happy might be a big word, but if they would be willing to offer a few reflection. And there's Teresa Tam and Caroline Quash. So I was wondering, Teresa, she's in pink. Beside Katie, we're going to bring a mic to you if you have a few reflections to share with us. So Teresa Tam was the head of Public Health Agency of Canada. And now she's, I don't know.
Free agent.
Free agent.
No, yes, I was the former Chief Public Health Officer working at the federal level and working with provincial colleagues, like the position that Caroline is in right now. And I'm also very excited about the launch of PERL and strengthening, I think, the linkages between government entities and the academic sector is really, really important, particularly when it's, all hands on deck for the response means that we have to prepare together. I think some of the fragmentation is definitely around. I agree with Conrad that the more that we can do to map out all the players and how we come together and support each other and our respective roles and responsibilities would be very useful. I just want to say that public health is political, and those of us who work in public health knows that. Public health should not be partisan or polarized, but it is political because of governance. The governance decisions are what makes the quarantine decisions or the border and travel health decisions. Someone like myself, not important, I don't get to make those decisions. It reflects, I think, on a number of factors like political pressure, public fear and anxiety at the time, the value systems that we have, which might be different between Canada and somewhere else. Geographical, geopolitical factors are very much at play. I think, so those of us who work at the intersection between the science and the political realm have quite a difficult job, and I think training the leadership that is able to work in that intersection is really important. I think the implementation of all those measures was really, really challenging. Extremely challenging, and when it's evolving and it's challenging with the public, but it's operationally extremely challenging to do it well, I think. Not something that I think we had envisaged to this scale before COVID-19. We always thought we would work together with the United States and Mexico. We had a North American plan. We've been doing all this planning. If it's in one country, it's already in the other country, and if you want to do anything at all, it should be a continental kind of approach because nothing else really makes sense. And so that didn't really quite work out in that fashion. And I think collaboration, coordination, which is preparedness, is an absolute must. It doesn't matter what context we're working, we still have to work across the border. Countries, as Kelley said, we were trying to align with the international, rules. But it became really obvious that you could potentially slow something down. And the countries that are listed at the top of the list of maybe doing well did those things really fast and early. So it is time to examine what is effective, what is not effective. There were many, many, many different layers of border and travel measures, which ones worked. When we had tests, which we didn't have before, pre-boarding tests, generally, we looked at our data, it was quite a good layer of protection. So I think I would really strongly support Kelley's perspective, which is we do need some global framework and some common tools for risk assessments, triggers, so that at least those could be considered in a more collaborative fashion. Otherwise, your question is, yes, chaos will occur again, unilateral decisions will occur, but maybe tools such as this, maybe as an extension of the IHRs or the pandemic agreement, would at least help reduce that type of chaos. But I think one thing that we tried to do was support the people who had to align with public health measures. I think the social, economic supports, but also quarantine supports, food, all of that had to be done in real time. Essentially commissioning hotels, you name it, we tried to do it. A lot of lessons were learned. So I do think that in the future, I always refuse to be totally negative. I was trying to always see some positive and think that we've learned something. I think the technical capacities and capabilities should be sustained, like these platform vaccine technologies. But I can't tell you what the political context would be at the time that the next thing, the big one happens. So we just really need to have better systems, better communication, and also just try to reduce the noise. But it will be horrible. It will be difficult.
Oh my God. Okay.
Encouraging.
On a happy note, maybe did you want to cheer us up, Caroline, or do you want to pass on this one? Yeah. Okay, this afternoon. So we're happy. So we're going to open up for people in the audience. If you have questions to our panelists. Can you stand? Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe introduce yourself. Be great.
I'm Christophe. I'm a PhD student at University of Montreal, and thank you so much for your great presentation. I have a question that a little bit disturbed me since the beginning of the activity. But it could be boring, but I think it's important to ask these questions. The question is, how do you see, economic interest, fit into the, how we call that, the pandemic preparedness? And that could define who could be stayed alive, who could be, passing away, and how do you see that? What is your reflection about these questions?
Well, I mean, we're trying to argue a lot in disaster preparedness and response. If we're better prepared, will lessen the impact, lessen the economic impact, right? And we're trying. I mean, it's the same issue in public health. We're trying to say, how do we get ahead of these things? And Teresa, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of great stuff that was done, but how do we keep that and understand that level of preparedness? And it does have an impact. And the other side, there was a lot of mistakes and a lot of money spent, that could have been better spent. But if you compress the time in any type of emergency, you're going to make more mistakes, and if you're not prepared, as opposed to being prepared. So.
I think the question was about economic interests, I believe, and the role in pandemic preparedness and response, because there's a whole there's much concern about the role of powerful economic interests in perhaps things like vaccine development and mask production and all these things. And did we get good value for money, or did they have a powerful role to play? And how do we involve the private sector? And of course, the world economy was horribly impacted by the pandemic. So there's a vested interest, I guess. I'm as someone who's studied the commercial determinants of health, I'm probably the most cynical person about the private sector. But at the same time, in doing my work around pandemic readiness, I recognize the private sector plays an incredibly important and actually irreplaceable role in many respects. But I think we need those governance mechanisms, those checks and balances that we perhaps don't have in some countries, to ensure that public interest actually overrides always, that we keep those vested interests in check, because otherwise, profit making should not be driving policy making in this situation. And this is where then we get into trouble. And those public-private partnerships that we rely on are not always well managed and governed. And so we're in a situation now where we have to do that. I work around new vaccine development, and I recognize the importance of pharmaceutical companies in this. They're irreplaceable for doing clinical trials, for manufacturing, and so on. But we also have to make sure that the public interest is served always.
Paul, you want to add something?
Just to say that in the United States, the post-mortem of COVID-19 economics has been that the economic hit that we took was caused by lockdowns, was caused by, in essence, blue state politics. And that will do fine if we're just left alone and not prepare economically, particularly. So I would say that the politics of COVID has altered the economic considerations of preparedness in ways that are extremely counterproductive.
Thank you. We're running out of time, I'm being told by the timekeeper, but I think there's one person in the back who was identified. Yes, please.
Dr. Wise, would you say that based on your visits to these detention facilities, was the environment deliberately designed to promote disease, or was it a coincidence? And based on your experiences, what actions by the public have you seen have a noticeable effect on vulnerable populations like children in these facilities?
Thank you. Really important question. Border Patrol was built for adult Mexican men looking for work. For decades, that's what detention on the border was about. They were basically jails, and they were police. All of a sudden, beginning 2014-15, then particularly 2018-19, hundreds of thousands of families and unaccompanied children were coming across the border. Border Patrol was just overwhelmed. 3 children died in Border Patrol custody the winter of 2018-19. 3 Guatemalan kids, Jacqueline, Carlos, Felipe. That's when I got appointed to the court, was in response to that. They've made a number of improvements on the Border Patrol side, on the border. Medical care 24/7, special food for kids, blankets. It's really quite different now than when it was then, but there's almost nobody at the border. But the amenities, the setup is better. We now have ICE because everything is turned to interior enforcement in the United States to eradicate any hope that you're going to live peacefully and thrive in the United States if you don't have papers. That's what's happening now. What's happening in the conditions holding, where ICE is holding families and kids is still a little unclear. They have this one facility in Dilley which has medical, they have a little school, but ICE has not been particularly open in divulging what's really going on. The 2 measles cases has petrified the advocates for children, not only there, but also where they're going to keep them if they're not sending people to Dilley. It's an open question, one that many of us are working very hard to figure out.
Okay, yes, sir, cannot.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on your very thoughtful comments, Paul. And first of all, incredible panel. But I think this is an example where this center can be very helpful. The whole idea of lockdowns, as I just spelled this morning, actually never really happened in the United States. That's a myth. 41 states put in lockdowns of some kind, whatever you call it, in March of 2020. Minnesota is an example where non-essential workers were basically said, you stay home. 82% of our workforce was deemed essential. Okay, that wasn't a lockdown. More importantly, by June 1, all but one of the 41 states that did kept it, and the other 40 didn't. What happened was we all acted out of our own fears. We didn't go public places. Restaurants shut down because nobody was showing up. Sporting events weren't happening because nobody was showing up. And I think one of the challenges we have is understanding human dynamics, human concerns during a pandemic like this, as opposed to just the fact that the myth continues, the government's ruined our economy. They didn't. It was us that did it to ourselves out of a logical and not unexpected fear of the virus. So I think this is a good example of where you can help clarify that and help look at what does the public actually believe or think or do when the next pandemic hits, and what really does influence and what doesn't. So I really appreciate your comments on that.
Good, thank you, Mike. I think we're going to end on this note. I think it's hard to summarize, what we've been discussing, but there's a word that's come across. It's about hope. There's eradication of hope for people who want to get into the States. The Red Cross bring hopes to many of our communities in Canada and have been doing it for decades. And then we hopefully going to get the right travel ban next time around. Please help me thank our panelists, and we were very grateful for their participation.